In what's being touted as the most unfair tax break on the books, the capital gains tax discount is back in the news. Media outlets are speculating again as to whether or not the current Labour government will reform the tax break, and the usual chorus of progressive voices are, to varying degrees, calling for change. The implementation of this tax break, introduced by the devil, John Howard, has turbocharged Australian house prices, causing the unaffordability crisis which we're reckoning with today. This tax discount means that the Australian government is foregoing $250 billion in tax revenue in the next decade, money that could be going to schools, hospitals, or new housing. Only by reforming or outright abolishing the discount can we hope to solve our housing unaffordability crisis. But frankly, this is bullshit. There is this totalizing narrative incredibly pervasive in Australian progressive spaces. At its most moderate, this narrative suggests tinkering with existing tax settings like decreasing the CGT discount or limiting negative gearing. At its most radical, it harkens back nostalgically to the post-World War II period, suggesting a return to the true realization of the great Australian dream. This sentiment is coming from a good place, but at its best, it allows people to believe solving the housing crisis is an easy fix, all down to the bad policy decisions of one man. Often, it's a coping mechanism that staves away the nihilism or doomerism which would undoubtedly rise if real estate was looked at more holistically. At its worst, it covers up that more holistic perspective, distorting the unfortunate reality of our housing problems, funneling discontent into being harmless. Reforming the CGT is a part of a raft of policy proposals which marks a progressive or left-wing nostalgia for the post-war period of the 1950s and 60s, where the great Australian dream was supposedly realised. Not only is this incorrect, but dangerous. The state of affairs of that period is not the solution to our problems today, but arguably where they started. The capital gains tax discount is an objectively bad policy. Essentially, if you have an asset and you sell it, you have to pay capital gains tax. However, in 1999, John Howard's Liberal government, with the bipartisan support of the Labour opposition, introduced the capital gains tax discount. This means that if you sell an asset you've held for a year or longer, 50% of the income you get from that sale, or the gain you get from selling, becomes tax-free. Essentially, it allows people who sell assets to not pay tax on half of the total money they make. This meant that if you invested in a property and you sold that property a year or more after you bought it, 50% of that money you would get would be tax-free. This meant that all of a sudden, there was a lot more money to be made in property. If you could guarantee a bigger return, you could borrow more from a bank and effectively demand more housing assets, therefore pushing up the price of housing. As such, since the 1990s, lending to investors has grown by 700%, whereas lending to first-home buyers has only increased by 33%. It also signifies both wealth and intergenerational inequality. As put here, over half of the benefits of the CGT discount go towards the top 10% of income earners, who are also overwhelmingly older property owners. In recent years, a consortium of different voices from the Australian Council of Trade Unions, the Greens, the Australia Institute, and even the Australian Labor Party until 2019 called for a decrease or an outright abolition of the CGT discount. You'll hear it being referred to as one of the main drivers of the housing crisis in this country. For example, as proved here by the current Secretary of the Australian Council of Trade Unions, Sally McManus.
One of the big reasons why housing is so expensive in Australia is because we've got a whole class of people who are effectively professional landlords. And why'd this happen? All goes back to a bloke called John Howard.
If only we lived in a world where we can blame everything on John Howard. There is a reason why, however, that policies like the CGT discount have been made out to be the one and only cause of our housing problems. It's easy. It gives people hope, it gives researchers at policy institutes, trade union bureaucrats, and political party operatives a job, and it gives the allure of being anti-establishment without really examining introspectively the problems with the property market, Australian culture, and politics. Here we can observe the makings of an informal bureaucracy that must manage this industry of dissent within Australian housing culture. If this constructed narrative remains discursively stable, this bureaucracy has reason to reproduce itself. More fundamentally, however, the reproduction of this bureaucracy is an integral component to enveloping progressive participation in the property market. The great Australian dream is so pervasive that even its dissidents are given hope through its narratives. They're subsumed into this hegemonic culture under the facade of rebellion, populism, or radicalism. We see this in many spheres of society, informal or formal. Juan Torre and Robert Webb's paper, The Waitangi Tribunal and the Regulation of Maori Protests, documents such regarding Maori rebelliousness in New Zealand. The state was able to regulate Maori protests through the Waitangi Tribunal either by ignoring them or channeling them through formal legal processes where grievances were less likely to interrupt the processes of capital accumulation. In his book Radicalized Real Estate Agents, John Wright's section on one of the more sophisticated officials of this informal bureaucracy, economist Cameron Murray, encapsulates the inherent flaw in this very common sloppyism. I'd encourage you to read this entire section, but I'll read out his conclusions. Hijackers and hijacking is a simplistic concept that doesn't bear scrutiny as an explanation for policy change. What should we do about their hijacking of the system? The answer? Cultivate political will to deliver system change, exploit any political crisis, generate electoral pressure to overturn financial interests, and, more assuredly, bypass the hijacked monopoly board. Altogether create an alternative economic system that delivers cheap housing and brings popular dreams to life. And from these abstract and broad-ranging points, the concept loses all coherency. For example, shouldn't we confront the hijackers? Doesn't the failure to confront terrorism only encourage more terrorism? Or put another way, we confront terrorism by leaving the hijackers and their hijacked plane on the tarmac, roll a new plane out on the apron, and have a new set of passengers aboard this alternative flight to realize dreams of cheaper housing. As an explanation of failure and perverse outcomes, hijackers and hijacking amounts to an explanation of disappointing policy outcomes that is abstract, unsophisticated, and ultimately unworkable. Likewise, Dr. Martin Duck in his PhD thesis, The Financialisation of Residential Capitalism in Australia, states that both the Australian Greens and Murray have put forward proposals for a public builder to supply homes into owner occupation at near cost. If implemented, these proposals would go a long way toward increasing the supply of homes with or against the building cycle. Yet they would in many ways reproduce the selling of public housing from the mid-1950s and its implicit tenure-biased logics, of which this thesis has been so critical. So before we dive into the particulars, we must first understand this informal bureaucracy that exists to envelop dissent into the hegemonic Australian housing culture. Be outwardly rebellious as they may be, the function remains the regulation of socio-political dissent. But as many who exist in this sphere are coming from a genuine place of concern, we should directly address such concerns. The period 1945 to 1999 is most commonly romanticized as the period of affordable housing. Then John Howard ushered in neoliberalism when the government stopped caring about public housing and treated real estate like a financial asset. Ever since, marketisation has continued. To borrow from before, no matter how well-meaning, this narrative is undefined and incoherent. Neoliberalism can be defined as a state-centered, hegemonic political project remaking capitalist production and social reproduction since the end of the long boom, shaped by a macroeconomic approach that sees inflation as a greater risk to economic development than unemployment and promotes the benefits of markets over state action. We'll get into what all this means, but importantly, neoliberalism didn't arise out of nowhere, imposed by a small cabal of Liberal Party operatives, and thus neither did our housing problems. So let's be a bit more specific. The period often romanticized specifically refers to the post-war period, the long boom, between 1956 and 1973. State governments had public developers and the federal government heavily subsidized and regulated mortgages in order to make housing as accessible as possible. But the motivations underpinning this housing paradigm were deeply nationalistic and chauvinistic compared to the more egalitarian or cosmopolitan attitudes which permeate progressive spaces today. These following sections may seem like a lengthy and unnecessary tangent to the point. However, this is essential if we are to grapple with the worldview that persists within dissent of contemporary Australian housing culture. Many progressives look to the period of the 50s, 60s, 70s for inspiration, where they can pluck isolated policies out of their historical context and apply them in the current period. And you know what? I think it's great to demand a public developer of public housing in the current day, or to try and repeal incredibly inequitable tax settings. However, we must understand that the period we're plucking our favourite policies from ended for a reason. As we'll begin to understand, our problems lie in that previous period, not our solutions. Then Liberal Prime Minister Robert Menzies saw the role of the state as a tool to construct a homogenous, sterile nation. Menzies said that the value of this middle class was first and foremost a stake in the country, that is, a responsibility for homes material, homes human, homes spiritual. For Menzies, class politics and the false class war meant the construction of the middle class capable of absorbing the working class, of annulling its more radical tendencies and the demands it might make. Menzies saw the state as a tool to facilitate the construction of a middle class, or a nation of little capitalists, otherwise working class people who would become property owners, augmenting their class interests. Propertyless working people who would otherwise be oppositional to their propertied bosses would then, through home ownership, begin to support the continuation of the capitalist mode of production, specifically in the realm of real estate. They would have a financial stake and interest in maintaining the current mode of production. It was potentially a very potent method of domestication. To be clear, the villain of the story isn't Robert Menzies. Menzies is merely the signifier and the voice of the material conditions of his tenure. As Hayward 1996 points out, the history of home ownership in Australia preceded Menzies by decades, and there was a strong desire on the part of Australians to own their own homes. What is unique about the post-war era is the reconstruction and crystallisation of the Great Australian Dream. This also marked explicit collaboration between the state and finance capital. The institutional architecture of post-war finance in Australia was actively shaped by state and federal governments, and thus government policy necessitated the active involvement of finance capital. Increasingly, this faction of capital, alongside their representatives in the press and parliament, was pushing for a separation between the state-owned Commonwealth Bank as a commercial trading bank and its function as a reserve bank. Menzies obliged in 1959, founding a separate, independent Reserve Bank of Australia. This was the direct result of finance capital being integral to the reconstruction of the economy post-World War II, particularly its role in rebuilding housing and mass home ownership. From the 1960s, private finance capital was actively encouraged to increase its mortgage lending as the public banks retreated from competition with the private savings banks and building societies. The federal government thereby used its privileged fiscal and financial position to create conditions for the rapid expansion of private finance capital that could extend mortgages to middle-income earners, deepening and widening the financial sector. Housing affordability in this period, therefore, wasn't a key aim or goal, but simply a necessary condition for the reconstruction of the Australian dream and of a subsumed working class. The state publicly developed housing and then sold most of it onto the private market to first home buyers. This doesn't mean that there wasn't public housing provided as public tenants, but that largely the government would be publicly developing housing and then auctioning it off privately. To quote Duck's thesis, this was not done to decommodify housing, but as one crucial aspect of a broader project of supporting capital accumulation and consolidating capitalist objectification. As such, investors comparatively weren't privy to the extensive breaks, subsidies, or overt state intervention homeowners were, and they found that private finance was difficult to attain and extended at high interest rates. For its time, this nation-building project worked. Homeownership rose from below 50% to above 70%. And this is where the informal bureaucracy will stop. They will point to the public intervention in housing and its effectiveness in this manner. But the intended consequence of such was that a nation of private property owners arose. A vast majority of the country and a majority of the working class directly incentivized to maintain a system where the price of housing, the value of their biggest asset, continually increases. For many working families, the home was, and still is, their biggest asset, the nest egg. Even back then, in a more strictly regulated environment, we can observe the effect. Easier access to larger mortgages did, however, facilitate a steady increase in the price of real estate as a more exclusionary model of home ownership emerged and property became a vehicle for capital accumulation. The pattern of reducing assistance for low-income earners and increasing middle-class welfare against the backdrop of rising asset prices was well established by the early 1960s as house prices rose. Between 1953 and 1963, the average national income per head increased by 30%, but the average cost of land and houses increased by 50%. In fact, as house prices continued to rise, the home ownership rate fell for the first time since the Second World War in 1971. The governments of the day didn't prioritize middle-class welfare or real estate price growth because they're cartoonishly evil villains, but they were merely responding to the dominant social classes in their electorates, one of which were homeowners. The property list became a minority to be discarded, their interests not considered in the national conversation. In fact, no one, no matter how radical, was immune. Even the Communist Party and the most militant trade unions supported mass home ownership. In capitalist societies, capitalists, those who own the businesses or companies who produce goods and services, i.e. commodities, compete with each other on a market. The capitalist who can produce the most commodities the cheapest is the most successful. This means that capitalists will tend to invest more in constant capital, or in other words, machinery and equipment. A mine is much more efficient, it can produce more profit if there are trucks, drills, and diggers, as opposed to simply just giving all the workers pickaxes. On the other hand, capitalists will invest less in variable capital, or the actual manpower, the socially necessary labor to produce commodities. This process of accumulation of capital as de-essentialization of work signifies the irreconcilable relationship between worker and owner, between proletariat and bourgeoisie. The owner, the capitalist, wants the cost of inputs as low as possible in order to maximize their profit. On the other hand, workers, the proles, want to increase their wage and work in better conditions, thereby increasing the cost of inputs and minimizing the capitalist profit. As capitalists have all the power in this relationship, they own the means of production and the property, workers often band together into unions and present demands collectively. This tug of war is constant, it's everywhere, and it moves history. Over time, this means that the rate of profit falls, as there is too much capital accumulated, too many commodities produced, and not enough demand to fulfill it. This tendency for the rate of profit to fall is central to the many crises inherent to the capitalist mode of production. This observation remains one completely and utterly untouched by the progressives who want to turn back to the social democratic paradigm of the post-war period. As we'll get into, this is a very critical flaw in the dogma espoused by this informal bureaucracy. By the end of the 1960s, global capitalism and Australia began entering into such a crisis. Class struggle elevated to an unprecedented level, as even the enticement of home ownership couldn't entirely conquer class conflict that Menzies had derided as false and mythical. In 1969, 1 million Australians went on a general strike, one of the biggest in our history. Industrial action skyrocketed after, as seen through the 1970s. The answer from the federal government was to deregulate or liberalize finance, essentially to make it easier for companies to borrow in the face of lowering profit rates, but also easier for consumers to borrow. This led to an asset price boom, specifically in housing. The owner-occupied housing market boomed as lenders extended 44% more credit in 1973 than they had in the previous year, and twice that of 1971. As such, there was a significant house price boom in most of Australia from 1971 to 1974. But as pointed out by Duck, this was done in a halting and piecemeal fashion amidst economic and financial crises, rather than a paradigmatic change across the economy. In fact, by the mid-1970s, finance was re-regulated as a way to curtail the spiraling inflation that was plaguing both Australia and the world at that time. Housing policy and the real estate market therefore reflected the tumultuous class conflict of the end of the post-war boom. The Whitlam government deregulated and re-regulated housing finance. It invested tremendously in public development, yet relegated public housing to the most underprivileged of society, further isolating public housing residents as socially outcast, propertyless, and reflecting the fact that private homeowners were the dominant social force within the working class. So yes, a majority of working people owned a property, but a majority of working people were also a member of their trade union, and many working class people took part in the struggles of feminism, queer liberation, First Nations rights, and the anti-war movement. The 1970s was a period where the deep contradictions of the capitalist mode of production finally had bubbled to the surface. Though you could make the argument that the reason why Australia didn't see the more overtly revolutionary current that some other countries saw in the late 60s and early 70s was because of its relatively bourgeois, home-owning working class. But anyway, this period of stagflation could not last. Piecemeal reforms wouldn't cut it, and the economy was still quagmired by elevated class conflict. Here in the early 1980s marks a paradigmatic change into the current period. Piecemeal reforms weren't cutting it. Capital and labour was still in an elevated, though mostly depoliticized, conflict well into the 1980s. As we can see here, the level of industrial action hadn't really declined all that much since the 1970s. The Liberal Fraser government that took after Whitlam's Labour was unable through its union bashing to curtail the labour movement, and as such, Australia's right was unable to cohere and implement a neoliberal reform project. Instead, that project was to be the signal achievement of the next Labour government. There were two key obstacles to boosting the falling rate of profit at this point: a militant trade union movement and a highly regulated and protected economy, more or less vestiges of the post-war era. Elizabeth Humphrey's PhD thesis, now book, How Labour Built Neoliberalism, goes into great detail here, but essentially, the union movement in Australia wasn't being demobilised by overt forms of repression. Simply just bashing the unions wasn't working. Rather, what Humphreys calls vanguard neoliberalism occurred, whereby the Australian Labor Party and its affiliated trade unions would themselves be the architects of a new political and economic order. To quote then Labor Treasurer, later Prime Minister Paul Keating, increasing the profit share was the name of the game. Now, this sounds contradictory. Why would the unions and their parliamentary arm, the Labor Party, be the ones to destroy the obstacles of capitalists, that being a militant working class and regulated economy? Things they fought so hard for in decades prior. That's maybe a topic for a different video and the topic of Humphrey's book, but essentially what you need to know is that the Labour Party at this point, led by the former head of the ACTU, Bob Hawke, courted the unions and capitalists of the day to strike a tripartite deal, and eventually came to enforce what's now known as the Prices and Incomes Accord. Essentially, the unions would stop striking, stop obstructing the capitalist mode of production, and in turn, the government would provide a variety of services or social wages, namely universal healthcare, compulsory superannuation, increased social spending, etc. What wasn't made clear were the intended economic or financial concessions made to capital, or the lack thereof. While the unions entered into the accord under the pretext that the Labour Party wouldn't deregulate the economy or reduce protection for local industry, the Labour Party turned around and did exactly that. A raft of neoliberal policies was enacted by the Labour government. Such changes were often directly against the spirit of the Accord agreement or developed in a way that made implementing the Accord more difficult. In most cases, these policy decisions were taken unilaterally and against the spirit of the Accord, in circumstances where the trade unions believed that they should have been consulted under the terms of the social contract. In fact, some unions were scathing of Keating's running of Treasury during the early years of the Accord, arguing that his approach was in contradiction to the letter of the agreement. In any case, the unions were demobilised with the carrot of social programs, though some had to be crushed with the stick, and in turn, Bob Hawke and Paul Keating deregulated the Australian economy. What this meant in practice was, through a series of reforms, making it easier for consumers and businesses to acquire credit and go into debt, and making it easier for banks to lend out to consumers and businesses. This manifested in many infamous policy decisions such as the privatisation of Combank, the floating of the dollar, the welcoming of foreign banks, the repeal of securities regulation, and abolition of all bank deposit controls. And as we can observe, the rate of profit began to tick up again. This process is called financialization, and it's a well-documented process whereby capitalist economies undergo a transformation, with profit-making via investment in production declining to be replaced by profit-making via investment in financial markets. As we can see, since Hawke's Labour Party was elected in 1983, credit creation thereafter dramatically expanded, becoming the dominant form of money in the economy. Okay, with all of that in mind, what do you think happens when you have a vast majority of a country whose biggest asset is their home, who increasingly can borrow more and more money from the bank to bid for a new house? Well, people began investing in housing, banks began lending out more and more credit to investors and home buyers. House prices quickly began to rise again. By the way, for all their faults, Hawke and Keating weren't stupid, they knew this. They were aware that the excessive growth in credit that they had incurred might very well inflate the value of assets and therefore overheat the economy. As such, for the first time in Australian history, Hawke introduced the capital gains tax. The absence of such a tax in the eyes of the government distorted investment decisions by encouraging investment in assets with returns in the form of capital gains over other types of returns. Essentially, the lack of tax on income from investing in assets like property deprived other more productive sectors of the economy of investment. We will get to why this is and was a misunderstanding, but this is crucial. The policymakers who implemented the capital gains tax first, i.e. the Labour Party and government bureaucrats, knew that the underlying financial conditions, which they had created via dramatically deregulating the economy, otherwise known as financialisation, would be the driver of asset price growth, and in Australia, primarily house price growth. Hawke introduced a tax on capital gains in 1985, though he made an exemption for owner-occupiers. Yet simply tinkering with tax settings was not enough to change the monumental financialisation of the Australian economy. There was simply too much credit being created and invested into real estate. This manifested as a property bubble between 1987 and 1989. Of course, the bubble wouldn't last. It popped in the famous recession we had to have, causing one of Australia's worst recessions on record. And it's very important that we screen what was being said about the property market after this crash, as it's directly relevant to what caused the housing boom. According to Professor Tom Valentine at the RBA's Decadal Conference in 1991, the asset price inflation of the late 1980s was to some extent a classic speculative bubble. As asset prices began to rise, the process was underwritten by the expansion of credit, which subsequently facilitated further asset price rises. Valentine also suggested that the favouring of owner-occupied housing probably encouraged overinvestment in this type of asset. In the view of a commission initiated by the Labor government, overinvestment in real estate had crowded out more productive investment in the Australian economy, while the non-taxation of imputed rent and capital gains exemptions for homeowners had increased demand for housing assets and pushed the price of housing up in general. Apologies for continually using long quotes, but here is Dr. Martin Duck's summation of the matter. Although negative gearing and the capital gains tax discount have rightly received attention for their part in increasing demand for real estate and pushing up prices, the fact that they only became lucrative and politically important with the advent of a liberalized financial system willing and able to extend credit for speculative real estate purchases is often overlooked or understated. Duck is absolutely correct. As we can see in these figures, credit creation rebounded and continued to expand significantly after the 1990 recession, and the ratio of debt to assets in households likewise began climbing. So when Oz Unions, for example, made a post quoting journalist Alan Collar saying this,
"Just listen to this.
The 50% discount that happened in September 1999 was 3 times the adjustment for inflation that it replaced. And the idea of it was that it would encourage people to invest in shares. The trouble is that 3 months later, no, 6 months later, in March 2000, the stock market crashed. So no one wanted to buy shares anymore. And so what they did was they bought investment properties.
It's just not true. I don't think this guy in particular at Oz Unions is being malicious or lying or anything, but at its best, it is just misinformation. And at its worst, it distorts the structural forces behind the uptick in house prices, which, just happen to excuse or ignore the policies of their friends in the Labor Party. Instead, first, credit creation began to uptick in late 1993 under Paul Keating after the recession, as home buyers and investors began to borrow more to buy more housing. Grant a bit of time lag for credit to circulate and we can see property prices follow suit. This is well before the capital gains tax discount was introduced in 1999. As said further by Duck, the introduction of the capital gains tax discount coincided with the steep fall in nominal interest rates, an increase in purchasers' borrowing power, and a commensurate increase in lenders' provision of mortgage finance. Simply just focusing on the CGT change doesn't capture the whole picture. All in all, this means that home buyers and investors were relying on more and more credit and going into more and more debt in order to buy more and more property. The discount allowed banks to lend out more money as they could guarantee a higher return through untaxed capital gains, but the underlying financial current existed regardless of varying tax settings. Okay, that was a lot, and it might not be immediately obvious as to why that was necessary to understand our current housing predicament. Aren't we talking about the capital gains tax discount? Let's do a brief-ish summary. In the 1950s, Australia became a mass homeowning society. 70% of the country, a majority of the working class in this country, became owners of private property. This was done in a tightly controlled and coordinated regime of finance between the state and finance capital in order to envelop the working class into becoming stakeholders of the nation, little capitalists who had no interest in the militancy or radicalism that was growing in the trade union movement. Mass home ownership, infrastructure, public housing, the regulatory environment, all of these things that a lot of the left look back retrospectively with great fondness were direct products or results of class struggle, of class conflict between a converging set of political and financial capitalists and an organized, unionized working class. And guess what? The union movement lost. They succumbed to the trend. They failed to properly mount a challenge to mass private property ownership. Over time, this meant that the working class and the majority of the electorate supported policies which increased the value of their biggest asset, their home. They began acting like landowners, and thus financial institutions like banks became accustomed to this new consumer. On the other hand, public works, programs and infrastructure got relegated to being welfare, reserved for those who are most socially outcast, those who have no sway or influence as a social force. But these changes were slow-moving, piecemeal, and not enough to curtail the falling rate of profit. The capitalist mode of production entered into a state of crisis in the late 1960s, both because of its own internal contradictions and conflicts, but also because of the internal contradictions within the Australian working class. While a majority of working people were owners of their own home, owners of private property, they were also a member of their trade union. The economic and financial settings of this time period therefore reflect the tumultuous and convoluted nature of the landscape of Australian class society. Then comes around the big scary neoliberalism. The postal regulatory environment and the relatively high union density proved inextricable obstacles to the rate of profit rising again. Therefore, the economy and financial world had to be deregulated, re-regulated, and the union movement had to be crushed. This was done very effectively by the Hawke and Keating Labor government between 1983 and 1996. But with deregulation and financialization comes excessive credit creation and therefore asset bubbles. In a country where 70% of people are homeowners, in a country where financial institutions are already so deeply invested in property, of course, the number one asset pursued is going to be property. Not only was it made substantially easier to access a greater amount of credit, but the banks had about 70% of the country being private property owners backing them up, meaning housing was seen as an incredibly safe asset to lend against. Hence the saying, safe as houses. In an effort to curtail some of the more excessive growth seen in financial markets, Bob Hawke introduced the tax on capital gains in 1985. This, however, had little effect as the housing market went into a speculative bubble in 1987. Interestingly, homeowners were exempt from the capital gains tax, further lending credence to the idea that homeowners are an incredibly influential demographic and social force in Australia. The bubble, of course, pops. We get a recession in 1990, one of our worst on record. Both the government, the RBA, and academic sense lay the blame of inflated house prices at the feet of financialization and its fundamental rewriting of how the Australian economy works. So all in all, we have this society from single homeowners to property magnates to large financial institutions, which by and large operates and is predicated upon the price of housing perpetually increasing. The advent of neoliberalism, a direct counter of capital in response to declining profit rates, ushered in a deregulated financial system and therefore a financialized economy, which essentially supplies an unlimited amount of credit to anyone who wants to continually bid up the price of assets, and in this case housing, further and further upwards. Everything we've discussed, this is what John Howard inherited. John Howard inherited this paradigm. He did not marketize housing. He's not the one who single-handedly ruined housing affordability in this country. He for sure made it worse, but he far from caused it. John Howard's tenure merely was the blunt representation of the dominant social forces in the Australian population. In 2003, he said it explicitly. "I haven't found anybody in 7.5 years shake their fist at me and say, 'Howard, I'm angry with you for letting the value of my house increase.'" He did, however, introduce the capital gains tax discount. A reminder of what that is, Labor introduced a tax on income made from capital gains, i.e. selling assets, in 1985. In 1999, John Howard introduced a 50% discount on that tax, meaning 50% of the income someone makes on selling an asset is untaxable. But again, while an incredibly poor policy decision and undoubtedly inflationary, it wasn't tantamount to creating all of our affordability problems. The introduction of the capital gains tax discount coincided with a steep fall in nominal interest rates, an increase in purchasers' borrowing power, and a commensurate increase in lenders' provision of mortgage finance. In this context, the treatment of investment housing as an asset like any other by the taxation system became a problem because real estate is very much privileged by both households and the financial system. In other words, because a vast majority of the country were already property owners and investors, and the financial system was increasingly relying on this safe as houses market, home buyers and investors were already incredibly privy to borrowing copious amounts of money to bid up house prices. The CGT discount was more fuel on the fire than anything else. Here is the current situation we are in today as a result of all of this historical development. 66% of Australians own their own home. All income levels, with the exception of the lowest income quintile at about 40%, have above 50% home ownership rates. 37% of Australians own their home with a mortgage, and 30% own their home without a mortgage. This means that a plurality of Australian households face potential negative equity and impaired finances if house prices fall too much, or in other words, if housing becomes more affordable. This directly impacts the ability for households to spend and thus spur economic growth. In a well-performing housing market, households can withdraw equity they've built up in their property and spend that in the economy. They can use that equity as collateral to borrow money from the bank and, again, spend in the economy. If they're in negative equity, well, they can't do that. Also, if they're in negative equity, they're often foregoing money otherwise spent in the economy in favour of paying back their mortgage. Moreover, negative equity restricts household mobility, so if someone was to sell their property and move, they would incur a loss. The financial system also depends on these households not falling into negative equity, as the banks loan money out with the expectation of a return. Often, banks will also bundle up these debts into what's called residential-backed mortgage securities, and they will trade these with other investors and financial institutions. If enough households see their homes fall in value, banks and these markets will be in big trouble. That's what happened in the global financial crisis in 2008. The catalyst for the GFC were falling US house prices and a number of borrowers unable to repay their loans. As house prices began to fall, the share of borrowers that failed to make their loan repayments began to rise. Lenders and investors began to incur large losses because many of the homes they repossessed after the borrowers missed repayments could only be sold at prices well below the loan balance. Today, 60% of bank lending in Australia goes into residential mortgages. For context, that number in the US in 2008 was 30 to 40%. So our financial system, and thereby our economy, is even more dependent on the performance of the real estate market than the US was in the mid to late 2000s. What's worse is that the big four Australian banks play an almost oligopolistic role in the economy. They are the biggest four shares on the ASX and comprise 90% of the financial system. This means that the banks and the wider financial system are structurally dependent on high and increasing house prices. And as the Australian banks go, so goes the Australian economy. Furthermore, superannuation funds, the institutions which control Australia's retirement savings, have likewise become integral to the survival of Australian capitalism. In the midst of the GFC, super funds held about a quarter of equity on the Australian Securities Exchange and contributed at least 48% of capital raised throughout the crisis to the recapitalisation of businesses. As detailed in this video here, the superannuation sector has increasingly coalesced in financial institutions that loan primarily into real estate. For example, 15% of superannuation assets were held in banks in 1996, and today that number is over 25%. This means the working class, who remember are majority property owners, benefit twofold from housing prices going up. They benefit as their largest asset, their home, grows in value, and they benefit in their retirement as their super balance grows in value. This also means what remains of trade unions are also invested in maintaining high property price growth, as the trade union bureaucracy in Australia help manage their members' superannuation funds. Taken all together, quite literally every aspect of your life is dictated by the performance of the real estate market, or in other words, house prices going up and becoming more unaffordable. It is really quite insidious. As such, the interests of the state in Australia are almost inseparable from the interests of property. There are differences and conflicts to be clarified for sure, like that of, for example, NIMBY homeowners and YIMBY developers. But by and large, the state and its Reserve Bank are there to maintain high and indefinite price growth in housing, or in other words, increasingly unaffordable housing for the coming generations. These are all deeply structural reasons behind why Australian house prices have risen so high. Instrumentally, politicians and political parties cannot campaign on lower house prices unless they want to face electoral oblivion. As discussed, the dominant social forces within the majority of the electorate are homeowners, both existing and aspiring. This is evident in the literature. Mass home ownership doesn't necessarily change partisan preferences, but it does change how political parties appeal to the electorate. Furthermore, developers and investors are incredibly well organised in Australia. For example, formulating peak bodies such as the Property Council, which have splashed millions of dollars on campaigns and lobbying in order to get their way. In my view, which I believe is at least somewhat rooted in the academic literature, this is why we're facing an unaffordability crisis today. It's because we, as a country, across class and political lines and boundaries, have constructed an incredibly insidious economy, which leverages our entire lives on perpetually growing real estate prices, growing prices which are increasingly debilitatingly unaffordable for younger people. Now, to be clear, this isn't even everything. There is always more to talk about, and I've left out some things for the sake of brevity. The residential construction industry is its own mess, experiencing its own profitability crisis, in part because it is, like residential home buyers, deeply petty bourgeois. However, what this video did cover was how previous periods of Australian capitalism informs our housing situation today. More than that, we covered how the past isn't where our solutions are, but where our problems began. It is much, much more than simply just tinkering with taxes. There is one more loose end that needs tying up. I went on a very big spiel about the union movement, but what of it today? Well, the decline of the union movement is a key reason why we can't just retroactively pluck our favourite policies from the 1950s and implement them today. As mentioned, the immense public works embarked on by respective Liberal and Labor governments throughout the post-war period weren't just because these politicians had such good ideas. No, it was because of class struggle. Marx didn't say the history of all hitherto existing society is the history of class struggles for no reason. Menzies and his capitalist allies explicitly implemented a strict regulatory environment and substantial housing investment in response to rising radicalism within the trade union movement, because working class people were increasingly joining their unions and were being militant. Australian union density peaked in the early 1950s at over 60%. Likewise, the previously Labour right Gough Whitlam is remembered by many on the left as a progressive icon, but many don't seem to remember that it was the trade union movement combined with other integral social movements at the time that pushed him to implement the sweeping reforms that are still loved by many. So even though a majority of working class Australians were homeowners, they were also simultaneously trade unionists, and thus that shaped the political and economic world at that time. Today, 13% of Australians are members of their union, and that's even lower for young people. Only 3.7% of 15 to 19-year-olds and 7.3% of 20 to 24-year-olds. Australia's proletariat is very demobilised and unorganised. There is no serious collective threat to capital in this day, nothing comparable to the 50s, 60s and 70s. As such, there is no social basis for the sweeping social democratic reforms that many people champion. Progressive organisations can talk about how great they are, how good this or that proposal will be, but if we're remaining strictly in the realm of electoral politics, trying to win in the marketplace of ideas, that's all these things will ever be, proposals. This tendency amongst the left today wants all the good and amazing public policy of the past without actually wanting to do the painstaking, on the ground, often decades long and non-electoral organising of working people, which laid and cemented the social basis for such policy that actually produced these wins, which forced governments to actually do something. And by simply suggesting that it's a small policy fix of something done by the one evil Howard, well, these organisations are inherently confining themselves to the electoral realm. Don't get me wrong, the intentions of this crowd are mostly good, but good intentions or good ideas wasn't what won the major social advances in this country nor across the world. Whether it be large-scale public housing construction, universal healthcare, basic rights at work, or abroad, the end of apartheid, these things weren't won with good intentions. They were won after, usually decades, of local organising in workplaces where working people began to be able to exercise collective power and then did so in a militant way, either by forcing the political class to the negotiating table or taking over entirely. So we can gesture in public in parliament during elections all we like, but the material reality of Australia in the 21st century is that there is no basis for an implementable renewed social democratic program, particularly regarding housing. Not only are working people not organised collectively to demand such, but the majority of working people are arranged financially to oppose such. A majority of working people are nowadays exclusively private property owners. A mass of private property owners whose biggest asset is their home wouldn't want a widespread public housing program. They wouldn't want housing that's off market. There's a very common perception amongst homeowners that increasing public housing decreases home prices. Even today, the majority of public housing investments made by state and federal governments are almost exclusively social housing investments, which are mostly owned and operated by private, non-profit associations, but rely on both funding from government and big financial institutions. This allows the government to maintain low-income housing or welfare housing, but keep the land or leases private and underpinned by finance capital. It also means that there is an ever-dwindling supply of social housing, as it's an incredibly ineffective way to build this kind of housing. Indeed, when we understand the current social relations of modern Australia, it not only becomes evident why ambitions regarding public housing don't resonate, but also why changing tax settings like the CGT discount or negative gearing has been so difficult. Sure, there is a concerted lobby, there is an upper crust of elites punishing the everyman, but that's overly simplistic and can't explain why that rhetoric resonates with middle-class Australia. Electioneering or dictating policies downwards to the populace has never been effective at pushing for significant social or political change. This is great at reproducing an informal bureaucracy that regulates dissent, but not one that actually channels dissent collectively and constructively. Such change must bubble up to the surface from the masses, from which politicians are beckoned to act. The capital gains tax concession and many other tax breaks like negative gearing are rightfully demonised and opposed by many progressive forces in Australia today. But whether it be the Greens, the Australian Council of Trade Unions, or the Australian Institute, all of these organisations and people operate in the framework of mainstream electoral politics, even if they're self-proclaimed dissidents. By laying the blame entirely on tweakable tax settings introduced by one evil man is at best good at staving away nihilism, and at worst actively stifles any potential collective dissent. This potential for collective dissent is managed by a self-reproducing bureaucracy of party officials, bureaucrats, and academics. We can't just pick and choose whichever policy we may like from a different time period and ram it into our current conditions. I mean, sure we can in a theoretical sense, and again, I don't oppose getting rid of the CGT discount and negative gearing or things along that nature. In fact, more than that, they need to be abolished. You know, this isn't me saying that we shouldn't campaign and endeavour for a mass public housing policy. But if we're actually fighting for these things in the real world, not just on paper, we need to reckon with our material conditions. We need to do a bit of political economy. That means recognising that the composition of class in Australia is just fundamentally different to what it was in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, and therefore the class struggle that developed these policies to begin with. Ultimately, we need to recognise that the defeat of social democracy and thus the consequent neoliberalism wasn't the result of good men with good ideas losing and bad men with bad ideas winning, but rather a product of class struggle. Class struggle between working people, capitalists, and their friends in government, but also inner conflict within these classes. Examining such research has revealed, as demonstrated by this video, that progressives today in Australia simply just fundamentally don't understand the rise of neoliberalism and thus our housing crisis, and also why we can't just go back to the post-war era. As said at the start, the post-war era social democracy isn't where our solutions lie, but arguably the progenitor for our problems today. Now, I've said a lot about organizing people in a non-electoral way, but still politicized in order to exert influence over parliament. This is called extra parliamentary power, whereby an organization or organizations use their power in society, use their leverage to force the government to the negotiating table or to adopt some kind of policy. To be clear, an elevated and ever-present class conflict where the subordinated classes and the subordinators exert extra parliamentary power over the government isn't a long-term solution, nor is it sustainable. There is plenty of literature out there on the limitations of mediated revolutionary struggle. But then, how do you actually build towards that struggle? Instead of coming out once every 3 years or so for your preferred political party, you can do that if you want, but in between, actually get involved in organizing your workplace, join your union, or get you and your mates together and create one if one doesn't exist. And there is plenty of literature and videos and tutorials as to how to get started with a union. This year, I was elected secretary of the Renters and Housing Union, as I think in Australia, housing and land is one of the most pertinent questions of our time. Beyond housing unaffordability in the current time period, what role has real estate played as an asset, as a commodity in the development of this country? If these are things that you're concerned about, if these are things that you want to act upon, then join your union, get involved. If you were to take one line of thinking from this video, it's that what you think politics isn't necessarily defined by electoralism, by political parties or a particular political candidate. It is the day-to-day life and conflicts that people endure. It's present in people's day-to-day lives, in their day-to-day struggles and conflicts, and we should act as such. We shouldn't resign politics, political action, political organization to the arbitrary and stringent confines of electoralism.